I am Captain Spawn, and this is day 300 of Spawn Year. For the third time this year, I find myself reviewing a kind of subject I have never in my career reviewed before. It's kind of a shame no one will ever read these journals. As dull and stagnated as I've so often felt, being forced to critique nothing but Spawn day in and day out, I've also simultaneously been forced to stretch my proverbial reviewing wings. I've now reviewed a board game, a set of trading cards, and after today, I will have reviewed a documentary. The game and cards were both intimidating because they were outside my usual wheelhouse. I'm used to writing about straightforward fictional narrative, and these other entertainment mediums have to be judged on their own entirely different set of criteria, which I'm less familiar with and feel far less qualified to comment on. Although after so many Spawn comics, I think I can call myself a veteran in reviewing not so straightforward narrative. And I found that no matter what it is, game, movie, whatever, any self-contained standalone piece is an absolute breath of fresh air after trying to keep so much sordid continuity straight in my head. Still, a documentary is a very different animal from anything I've tackled. It's still a story of sorts, but a work of non-fiction about a real person, and most importantly, a person who has greatly affected me personally with his work. The challenge today is to write about essentially a 70-minute film biography about a man whom I have myriad preconceived notions about. It is impossible for me to look at this piece or this man completely objectively. Then again, I can't do that with his fiction either. Any Spawn comic I review is now from the lens of a reader who has experienced the rest under certain conditions. His strong opinions about what's come before, has uncontrollable expectations about what's to come, and try as I might to be fair and constructive, all of that creates personal bias which no doubt affects me at a subconscious level. And that bias hasn't gotten me buried alive yet, so I guess impartiality isn't a prerequisite for getting through Spawn Year. Todd McFarlane, The Devil You Know, directed by Kenton Vaughn, spends much of its time in McFarlane's corporate office. We see a lot of his business life circa 2000, and we get a lot of his life story in his own words. The film focuses primarily on McFarlane's love of sports and his failure to become a Major League Baseball player, then his breaking into comics as a writer, his falling out with Marvel over their censoring of his violence in Spider-Man, and the phenomenon that was Spawn afterwards. It's the classic rags to riches story, the tale of a man who had nothing but talent and intuition, and who turned that into an empire. What I like most about the movie is that it isn't a fluff piece. It paints McFarlane as an extraordinary and fascinating person, but it isn't a defense of how he runs his business or of his ego or of the extreme level of violence his comics have so often been criticized for. Certainly McFarlane himself addresses these things, sometimes defending himself, and sometimes outright admitting he's not perfect. But the film's agenda seems to be to get as far into McFarlane's mind as it can and letting the viewer be the judge of what kind of person he is. It allows his parents, his wife, his friends, and colleagues to candidly discuss the man. Nobody seems to be doing much sugarcoating, and McFarlane himself seems very genuine and honest. If the movie has a point to make, it's that Todd McFarlane is a walking contradiction, and that he knows that. He's the creator who hated the corporate establishment, left, was successful because, unfettered by any boss above him, he put his innovative talents to work creating something he loved, and as he puts it, knew a lot of guys would love because at heart, he's just a regular guy. And so he knows if he likes it and it's not out there, a lot of other regular guys might love it too. And then before long, he becomes the establishment, and as he puts it, he turns into that thing he hated most. Interestingly, and I'm surprised no one in the film puts it this way, McFarlane almost makes a deal with the devil to get what he most wants. He could have remained the bold underdog instead of the king of a merchandising juggernaut, but then how could he get his art out there without compromising it? Or maybe a more apt metaphor is he refused to sell his soul to the devil, so instead he had to become the devil, thus the title. And I also really like the title because I do feel like I know him better now. Looking at this in narrative terms, if McFarlane is our protagonist, he's a fully realized, three-dimensional, unique, and compelling one. He is wonderfully complicated, flawed, contradictory, but brilliant in his art and his sense for business and what people enjoy. He seems to have real respect for his fans, trying not to take them for granted because, as he says at a convention, they put food on his table. He's passionate and a ruthless businessman, and unabashedly extremely opinionated. He says if the world worked differently, he'd love a part-time job executing criminals who mutilate innocent people. And he's totally arrogant, but I was at times charmed by his arrogance because he often seems to come by it honestly. At his most down-to-earth, toward the end, he talks about how his success and fame have changed him, and he describes it almost like a necessary evil. He wanted to produce art. That takes capital, and if you're really good at it, you can get a lot of capital, and it's hard not to become what you used to fight against in order to get that necessary thing to facilitate your art. And is that a cop-out? Is that cynical? I feel like I'd have to achieve that level of fame to really know. But what's compelling, and what makes him a human being, is how hard it seems he fought it, in the pride he takes in still seeing himself as a blue-collar guy, and how he doesn't dress like the upper crust, and how he genuinely doesn't appear, from what we see here, to look down on people with less money than him. And given how he talks to some of his employees when he thinks they're full of BS, he doesn't look like he's putting on much of an act for the camera. One of the details that most surprised me was that it was a full year when McFarlane was getting famous for Spider-Man at Marvel before any of his family realized he was already a millionaire. He didn't want it to change him. And yet, you look at things like the gimmicky incentives, chase figures in his action figure company versus his criticism of variant covers and oversaturation in comics to entice collectors and dilute the market. And by the way, he did some of those covers himself much later, and I don't see a difference. It did change him. But I find him sympathetic because he's clearly really uncomfortable with that. And I had a lot of respect for him, despite his flaws, for allowing that vulnerability to shine through. Maybe my favorite moment is at the end, where he says someday the world will realize he's just an ordinary Canadian who pulled the wool over their eyes all this time, and then we'll all move on. In one huge fundamental element of his personality, I deeply admire Todd McFarlane. He didn't lose his drive or ambition when his first dream didn't pan out. Even when he was first getting rich off of comic books, McFarlane called himself an athlete first and said art was just how he was paying the bills. At the beginning of the movie, he says his biggest dream is to play in the major leagues, and that doesn't change even though he knows he missed the chance and it'll never happen now. He was almost on a Canadian team in the major leagues, was 26th out of 25 in a 25-man team, and when that shot was over, he pursued comics with the same determination and relentlessness he pursued baseball, and discovered he was better at it. Maybe the quote that will most stick with me is when he said, "The artists that inspired me most were the terrible ones." Instead of mimicking or building on the greats, he completely invented his own method based on what he didn't want his work to look like, from the art he didn't like. I was most impressed with McFarlane's refusal to get discouraged by failure, his tenacity, his initiative. And I'm even more baffled by how unmotivated and apathetic he made the protagonist of a story he claims is inspired by his own life. He says, "I can write about my own life a heck of a lot better than anyone else's." He cites very broad, superficial personality traits of Al Simmons as parallels to himself. They both have a bad attitude, they both care about their family more than anyone else, everybody's named after people he knows. Yes, but Todd, you're interesting and Spawn isn't. If Spawn were more like Todd McFarlane, he'd be more driven, snarkier, and a lot more fun. If McFarlane had somehow written more of his own life into the book, it might have been great. That's how you make characters come alive, even in a high-concept fantasy story. And as I've surmised before, those few interlude one-shot stories that were more down-to-earth probably came more from his personal experience, but he kept falling back on murky and generic mythology, and it lost all that. When he gave up his dream of playing baseball for a living and turned toward art, McFarlane was playing toward his strengths. Why couldn't he see he wasn't doing that when he was writing? The way he discusses ownership and creative freedom, I suspect he wrote and plotted so much because he felt in control. Of course, he doesn't talk about his writing failings because, from a business standpoint, they don't matter. The books were a phenomenon, and he probably thought his writing was fine, or at least fine enough, between the success of that and his Spider-Man title. And he probably wrote instead of drew because, as we see in the film, his business concerns eat up most of his day, and I can empathize with his desire to stay creatively involved, even though I think that made the story practically unsalvageable. And I still think that success blinded him to better creative directions, like Morrison's, that he ignored when he should have taken advantage of them. There are a number of things the film either glosses over or skips completely, and at only 70 minutes, I think it could have stood another 20 minutes to paint a fuller picture of McFarlane's history. There is no discussion at all about the creation of Image and the other creators involved. Weird that a McFarlane documentary never even mentions Rob Liefeld. And if you saw this with no prior knowledge, you'd think Spawn was the only book Image published. There's also nothing about anyone McFarlane worked with on Spawn. There's a whole gallery of mostly Capullo covers, but he's never even mentioned. Regarding presentation, I like the simplicity of the film. No overbearing voiceover, no cute transitions, and whenever it needs to present facts, it uses a simple intertitle, and it doesn't have to fall back on that more than a few times. There are maybe more sound effects than are necessary. Sometimes, to empathize the questionable violence in Spawn, panels are accompanied by sounds, mostly from the animated series, which is a little distracting, as is some of the odd and quirky synthesized music I may never get out of my head. Given McFarlane's business connections to Kiss and Korn, I was surprised it didn't have more of a rock or metal vibe. The first half sometimes feels a bit disjointed and unfocused, like there's not much rhyme or reason to why you're seeing interview footage in the order you're seeing it in. Once it gets to the development of a Spawn comic, it's far better organized. I'm really glad I saw this movie, and it makes me curious to see what McFarlane is like now, over a decade later. Ironically, seeing the story of McFarlane's career satiated my palate for a thoughtful character study, a thirst rarely quenched during Spawn year. I like that so much of the negative aspects of McFarlane's personality come out here because I'm better able to appreciate the positive and trust what I'm seeing. It's a strange experience to vehemently detest so much of McFarlane's narrative choices, but appreciate him here, and even agree with a lot of what he has to say. Todd McFarlane isn't a good writer, but I really believe, given some perspective, if he put his mind to perfecting that craft the way he did his art, the potential is there. McFarlane isn't the devil. He didn't put me in Spawn year. If I weren't here, I could have chosen to stop reading, and the fact that Spawn fell out of popularity may prove that great art isn't enough to keep people's attention when your story doesn't work. I admire Todd McFarlane, despite all the headaches his work has induced, and I'll use his example as I push forward to finish the final 65 days of Spawn year, and not the example of his sluggish and unmotivated creation. Signed, Captain Spawn.